Well, good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all here today on the 27th of October, Wednesday, to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council's Levers for Change webinar. And today's session is on infrastructure planning. So thank you all for joining us. Before I get into proceedings, I'd just like to first, on behalf of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various land on which we meet today. Today we've got participants from across Australia and New Zealand. For me, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge their deep connection to land, water and culture, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today, my name is Toby Gray. I'll be facilitating this session today, clearly. I'm the General Manager of Sustainability, Ratings and Delivery here at the IS Council. And as someone who's spent a large part of my career in the infrastructure planning space, this is a topic that's quite dear to me. And the timing is also very pertinent for this session, as we are currently undertaking a review of the IS planning rating product and forming an industry advisory group to support this work. But really, I'm quite honoured to be here and to facilitate this session with such an impressive group of presenters. But before we get into proceedings, just administratively, you'll notice that the videos and chats are turned off today. But please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A tab below, and we'll endeavour to address them all in the Q&A part of the agenda, which is at the end of the proceedings. But before we get into the formal thing, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the Levers for Change. These are the IS Council's Big Picture Thought Leadership Series, and offered exclusively to IS Council members. These events look at the challenges and opportunities in infrastructure sustainability across Australia and New Zealand and beyond. Today, we're building assets, infrastructure assets that will operate for the next 100 years and beyond. And we're doing this in a rapidly changing socio-economic and environmental context. So the question is how can we deliver resilient net zero infrastructure that both serves and energizes our communities? And how can these assets continue to deliver value over time? You know, from problem statements through to delivered assets and beyond, there are great opportunities to maximise infrastructure's contribution to society, but it's really at the very early planning phases that some of the greatest outcomes can be realised and banked. Next slide, please. So today, we're honoured to have some of the most progressive thinkers in the space of infrastructure planning to share their perspectives and ideas. Our panelists come from a range of backgrounds, from government investment and statutory planning in Australia and New Zealand. First up, we have Lalani who's the Deputy Secretary of Te Tai Ohanga, the New Zealand's Treasury, followed by David Gainsford, who's the Deputy Secretary of Assessment and Systems Performance at the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, followed by Marie Parker, who's the Deputy General of Infrastructure Regional Strategy at the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning in Queensland. So first up, I'd like to introduce Lalani. Welcome. If you could turn your camera on. Lalani is responsible for overseeing the management of the New Zealand government's activities in the capital and export credit markets, infrastructure in and urban growth investment, and the performance of the Crown's entities and financial institutions. Lalani has had a career spanning over 25 years with extensive global infrastructure and finance experience, having held leadership roles in global investment banks, Australian commercial banks, and the Australian public sector. Lalani is currently also on the advisory board member for Infrastructure Partners Australia. So welcome, Lalani. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'll hand things over to you.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina taiwha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, the iwi Māori and iwi whenua momoa. which is the Dreamland peoples, and acknowledge their mutual connection to land, water and culture. Thank you, Toby, for your introduction, and to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council for the invitation to discuss how New Zealand is embedding wellbeing in our infrastructure outcomes and planning. In 2013, when I first joined the New South Wales Public Service, infrastructure investment was based on identifying what needed to be built to meet the demands of who would use it. Analysis was based on what investment was deemed to be the right project to address the infrastructure investment deficit. Planning followed infrastructure asset decisions until thinking expanded to consider population growth requirements, and this created a real pivot towards city planning that saw infrastructure being part of enabling vibrant communities and cities where people work, live and play. With this shift to outcomes and infrastructure integrated with urban development, the traditional analytical tools like benefit cost ratios were challenged, and still are, in their ability to really support holistic decision-making by government. And they really struggle to deal with the fact that the problems that are faced in our economies and societies are getting increasingly complex. So if you consider climate change or environmental degradation, the pollution of fresh water, changes in work environment because of new technology or pandemics, things like inequality and social disconnection, the problems we are all facing are increasing further in complexity and are really multifaceted. So over the ditch, over almost that same period, New Zealand Treasury had been developing their thinking in the recognition of these complex issues and created an approach that focused government's investment decisions on improving the wellbeing of New Zealanders through the Living Standards Framework. So the LSF tries to incorporate all the different factors about what makes a good life into the thinking about what government can do to promote an environment where New Zealanders and businesses, households and whānau and families can flourish and can do the best that they can to maximise their own wellbeing. It considers current wellbeing and future wellbeing factors. So current wellbeing are things that represent all different facets that enable people to live a great life, whether it's income, housing, safety, education, security, health. These are all an example of the different dimensions of current wellbeing, very similar to the wellbeing factors promoted and measured by the OECD. For future wellbeing, we have the concept of 4 capitals, which enables us to promote our own wellbeing now and into the future, whether that is through land, buildings, infrastructure and financial assets, the physical and financial capital, through human capital, which is the skills and knowledge that we have in our health, of course, the way we interact with each other in our communities, our social capital, and finally, our natural capital, all the aspects of our natural environment. So the LSF adds wellbeing analysis to our current suite of traditional tools to support the provision of comprehensive advice for government decisions. In more recent times, the Hearo Waioro framework was developed, and it's centred on bringing the Te Ao Māori view of wellbeing to our analysis. The framework identifies the hana, or the ends, as the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, such as health and wellbeing, protecting our natural world, and improving the mana, the strength of our people, with the means based on te kana, the right ways to help us achieve them, such as values, processes, and importantly, partnership with Māori as per the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So when used together, the LSF and the Hearo Waioro frameworks help ask the right questions and enable analysis of wider perspectives. It enables traditional binary either-or thinking, such as building lots of houses and infrastructure or protecting the environment, to be more nuanced and developed to an and way about how to do both for all New Zealanders. I know that everything that I've said in the last few minutes has sounded pretty conceptual, so I thought I'd share an example of the frameworks in practice. In 2018, the then New Zealand government committed $1.5 billion to work with the community to revitalise Eastern Porirua, which is about 15 minutes north of Wellington. At the time, parts of Porirua were very deprived. More than 2,000 state houses built about 50 to 60 years ago, a significant gang presence, high levels of crime, and poor health and education outcomes. Treasury was asked to conduct analysis on whether to invest in its regeneration. For this type of investment, impacts are distributed across government, and utilising the typical business case and cost-benefit analysis, considering the fiscal and economic impacts only, would have led to an outcome to not invest and to let the area continue to deteriorate, because the cost of housing would have far outweighed the benefits. The application of the Living Standards Framework focused on considering the benefits of investment from the perspective of the affected community, looking at regeneration as an investment in health, in education, safety, and economic prosperity that is enabled by housing and infrastructure and community development. For example, warm, safe, and dry housing can reduce hospitalisation, creating fiscal savings from not having to pay for a hospital visit, and economic value from the increased productivity of that person, and the value that the individual would place on not having to go to hospital. It enabled both the cost-benefit analysis to consider fiscal, economic, and wellbeing impacts, and a regeneration investment to be supported. As you may be aware, there's a significant amount of reform currently underway in New Zealand, with many opportunities to further embed wellbeing considerations into the way that we do things now into the future. And from an infrastructure planning perspective, the infamous Resource Management Act is one of the key pieces of legislation being reformed. So earlier this year, the government announced that this one act is being replaced by 3 pieces of legislation, one that focuses particularly on protecting and restoring the environment and enabling development, one focused on the development of long-term regional spatial strategies to coordinate and integrate decisions, and one focused on climate adaptation. So at its heart, the new suite of legislations will create this foundation to support better infrastructure planning that aims to protect and restore the environment and its capacity to provide for wellbeing of present and future generations, and instill the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. The focus of incorporating wellbeing and the Te Ao Māori perspectives into the design of these pieces of legislation will ensure that from the beginning, from the initial planning phases, the future infrastructure investments will be considered through fiscal, economic, and wellbeing lenses, supported by the application of Treasury's living standards and He Ara Waiora frameworks. I appreciate I've covered a lot of ground in the last 7 or so minutes, but I hope I gave you some indication of how we're trying to embed wellbeing into our infrastructure agenda and into our planning frameworks. Me mahi tahi tātou, mo te oranga o te katoa. We must work together for the wellbeing of all. Thank you. I look forward to David and Marie's presentations and the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Lalani. That's absolutely fascinating, and I think we can honestly learn a lot from the approach that you're taking over there, and the great example that you've just given is really fascinating. And I look forward to digging deeper in the Q&A session. But up next, we're joined with by David Gamesford. David, welcome. David heads up the Assessment and System Performance Division at DPI here in New South Wales. David and the division are responsible for assessing the development applications for all major projects within New South Wales, including major infrastructure, high-profile commercial developments, and key resource developments. His experience includes 25 years in the New South Wales government roles and in the private sector in major project development, assessment, and infrastructure delivery. David's here to talk to us today about how sustainability is incorporated in the assessment process for major infrastructure developments in New South Wales. And so welcome, David, and over to you.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks Lalani for that great introduction, and thanks for the invite today. I also want to acknowledge traditional custodians. So I'm here on Wongal land in Sydney, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any First Nations people with us today. Maybe if you can just move on to the next slide. So as Toby was mentioning, my expertise, and I guess the area that I manage within DPI here in New South Wales, deals with development assessment, and specifically with the state significant projects that we have a portfolio of in New South Wales. And so that does cover major infrastructure projects, so the road, rail, dams, hospitals, schools, all of those types of infrastructure. I also manage the teams that deal with major resource projects and some of our key site projects. I guess the main sort of thing I wanted to mention here in terms of this slide and I guess a simplified sort of analysis of the steps that we take in our development assessment process, which I'm sure are quite similar across different jurisdictions, is the way that we can embed sustainability into that system. So clearly embedding sustainability and having those conversations around sustainability at an early stage is really important. And so we have a lot of input into with our key sort of applicants with them at a very early stage, and you know, we've partnered with the Infrastructure Sustainability Council for some time to make sure that there's good connections there. But also once we get to the end of our assessment process and those projects are moving into a delivery phase, we also have a key role in terms of setting requirements on those projects and setting conditions that are related to those projects. So on to the next slide, please. But those projects, I guess, don't pop out of, you know, just out of thin air. The strategic sort of planning network and the strategic planning work that's done to identify those projects is critically important. And in New South Wales, we've been developing a new approach to that strategic planning, and particularly focusing on precinct planning. And I'll come to in a minute to a few case studies that sort of emphasise the importance of these precincts. Clearly, the work within these precincts is about sort of bringing together that infrastructure delivery and land use planning into a strategic vision, and what the department's been doing here is really sort of getting involved more at an upfront sort of level, working collaboratively with councils and other state government agencies, because there are trade-offs, and it's important at this sort of period of strategic planning to be having those conversations and being collaborative. Where required, the state is stepping in and actually looking at rezonings and looking at those precincts in quite a lot of detail, particularly here in Sydney, where we've got some, which I'll go through in a minute, a couple of examples of some really complex and interesting both brownfield and greenfield development areas. And it's at those sort of periods and at those sorts of stages that we can really embed sustainability and then ensure that the projects that then come out of that work that's been done, I guess, continue on with those principles being formed. So maybe on to the next slide, please. So the first one, I guess, and just orient those that aren't that familiar with Sydney. The Bays precinct, Roselle and Bays precinct here is just to the west of the Sydney CBD. And it's an area that is under a huge amount of development at the moment and a number of infrastructure projects. So the spaghetti sort of diagram that you've got up there on the page shows a number of road projects that are sort of linking up, and there's a new harbour crossing that's about to get underway. There's also a new metro train line which will be coming through this area, and a number of different developments, and you can see a new station there, the Bays station. So within this area, I guess there's a huge sort of challenge because it's a very densely developed part of Sydney, and it is an area that is undergoing a lot of pressure from the impacts of these projects, which will happen over not a short period of time, but actually over a decade or more. And so what the department's been doing here is to help try and coordinate the activity that's happening in this area. And particularly as we've developed some guidelines recently, which we've recently published around cumulative impacts, and also around social impact assessment and strengthening our social impact assessment guidelines. that's particularly sort of relevant in this aspect and in this area. And the department's really been trying to bring together and develop a strategic sort of social risk framework for this area in the way that these projects are being coordinated and in the way this precinct is being developed. So it's a critically important aspect of the work that we're doing now, rather than just being focused on project by project sort of issues. Onto the next slide. The other very large precinct that's undergoing a lot of activity at the moment is that associated with the Western Sydney Airport, the new Western Sydney Airport, which is being developed by the Commonwealth Government. And the state government has identified that that airport is being used as a catalyst, if you like, for development of a number of different precincts in and around the airport, which are shown on this slide. The department's having a really key role in working on the development of this area, and has been working with a number of different stakeholders, both councils. There's several councils that have jurisdiction over this area, and also a number of infrastructure providers. So as you can imagine, the airport itself, there's a number of different infrastructure projects that are being developed to connect to the airport, but also as the area around the airport develops, there are a number of different infrastructure provisions that need to happen. So that coordination role, and looking at the way that you know, there can be a better collaboration in the way the infrastructure is provided in this area is a key sort of role that the department's playing here. I guess in the way that is developing up, there's also a focus on this area to be very much seen as a parkland city. So the protection of biodiversity and the protection of and enhancement of open space and parkland in the area is seen as a key sort of fundamental of development of these areas as well. Next slide, please. The last one I wanted to mention, which sits outside of Sydney, is a large development, the Inland Rail project, which is a 1,700 kilometre connection between Melbourne and Brisbane. A large proportion of that which goes through rural New South Wales. So this has the ability to I guess, transform both the way goods are moved through the state, but also there's huge opportunities for some of the key sort of nodes on this inland rail route. So the department's been working really closely with the Australian Rail Track Corporation, who's delivering this project, again, to look at how sustainability can be embedded into a series of projects. So that the proposed delivery of this project is being broken up into stages, and there's a series of different stages that we've been working with ARTC on. For example, one of the abilities of this project is that it's trying to reuse and utilise as much of the existing rail network as possible. And so we've been working with ARTC and some of the initial sort of stages of the project. There has been a redeployment of existing timber sleepers and existing steel track. There's also fabulous opportunities that we've been working with ARTC on in terms of employment opportunities for local areas, and also bringing together Indigenous industries as well. Yeah, the department's played a key role in the development assessment and the working of the delivery of these projects. So Toby, I might leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. It's a shame that we only have such a short window each, because I think we all probably want to hear more about those projects. And I think overall, just hearing the department's and the state government's role as custodians really of those precincts and creating those better places with good social and environmental outcomes is really fascinating. But to keep things on schedule, which I'm lagging behind already, so we'll move on to Marie Parker. Welcome, Marie. I'm very excited to have you from the northern state of Queensland. But Marie is the Deputy Director General of Infrastructure and Regional Strategy at the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning in Queensland. Marie has worked in regional and economic development for over 15 years across a number of Queensland government agencies, and her approach is categorised by forming strong partnerships with regional and other organisations, as well as statutory bodies to deliver on economic priorities. In 2020, as the Deputy Under Treasurer in Queensland Treasury, Marie oversaw the delivery of the Queensland Economic Recovery Plan, which is supported by regional economic plans. And today, Marie is also an active contributor to national eye bodies and groups convened by Infrastructure Australia. So welcome, Marie. Very excited to have you here. And over to you.
Thanks very much, Toby, and nice to be talking with you all today. I'd first like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I am contributing today, which is the Brisbane area, the Jagera and Turrbal people. And I'm a Sunshine Coast girl, born and bred, for those of you who know to the north of Brisbane. So also would like to pay my respects to the Gubbi Gubbi people of the Sunshine Coast, traditional owners. So I would like to just start by saying my presentation is really around the work we've been doing on the state, draft state infrastructure strategy. And I wanted to talk about how sustainability is built into and at the core, I guess, of the work that we're doing around the strategy, and to talk about some of the principles and the approaches that we've used. So first of all, the strategy was released in September. It's gone through an extensive consultation process to get to this point, lots of input from different groups in the community, and now we are looking at a release of a final strategy in probably halfway before we get to the middle of next year, finally. And it's accompanied by regional infrastructure plans, which are really the embodiment of the principles and ideas that are in the strategy. So it's very much kind of a spatial application of that, just to give you the framework that we're using. It's a 20-year vision, and it's really about fundamental principles, as you can see there, of boosting productivity, growing the economy and creating jobs, but doing that with sustainability and resilience at its heart. Next slide, thanks. There are 4 guiding objectives. You can see that enhancing sustainability and resilience is one of those. And we are very focused on building those principles into the strategy as a whole. And our conversations with agencies that are contributors to this has been, sustainability and resilience have been at the heart of those conversations at almost every level and on almost any topic that we have spoken with agencies about, which has yielded some really interesting and good conversations that had we not used that lens, we may well not have got to with agencies and industry. Thank you. Next slide. Our focus areas, which are really meant to be saying, here's where we're going to be paying particular attention and actioning initiatives over the next few years of the strategy. You can see those there. I won't read them out for you, but creating livable communities and building a games legacy have been where we have had some really interesting conversations about how you design sustainability into your planning for an event such as the 2032 Olympics. The regional focus, and I mention regional infrastructure plans because that is a really important and new initiative for us to be developing these specific spatial plans. That has included many conversations to date, and I'm sure will continue. around both climate resistance. Regions obviously are at the forefront many times of the impacts of weather events, and we get our fair share up here in Queensland, as you know. Forecast this year would suggest we will get at least 5 cyclones crossing the coast at some point this year. And Northern Queenslanders are very good at the idea of resilience. What we want to do is make sure we're building those principles heavily into any planning around new infrastructure, but also maintenance and betterment of existing. Thank you. Next slide. So this is the one I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on, I guess. We have focused on sustainability and resilience as our core principles, and the objective is to reduce environmental impact from infrastructure development, but it's also to improve infrastructure resilience, as I mentioned, and very much at the heart of that is adaptation through better design. So we're having different kinds of conversations with government agencies, and typically the big agencies that are the big infrastructure contributors: health, education, TMR, trade man roads. Those are our real focus areas, to think about how we, at very earliest stages, are really considering what else we can do in terms of betterment. Transport and main roads are hugely embedded. They have this embedded already, and they've been really fruitful conversations for us. Part of it is, how do we actually take some of the learnings from the roads infrastructure program and build it in to vertical infrastructure. So that's been an area where we've had some very interesting conversations. We think about it in terms of the how of sustainability, so the practical application of those sustainability objectives, including right down to recycling of materials, glass, tyres, reused asphalt, all the way through to energy programs in schools and hospitals. So we're trying to take a program view, a capital program view for government across all of those areas in the development of the new strategy. We also talk about the why of resilience, so scale and frequency of extreme weather events, and I've mentioned that already as never far from our minds in Queensland. But in what can we do to actually reduce impact, and how do we design infrastructure so that it's both resilient and adaptable over time? So those are some of the major questions that we're really considering as we move forward. Thank you. And I'll just finish off on the next one. So the other big opportunity for us, as you no doubt are aware, is the 2032 Games. This is there is a climate positive games guarantee, which has been part of Queensland's bid for the Games. And so the challenge in front of us now is, what does that look like? And what we're very focused on in this agency particularly is, how do we use infrastructure to leave a positive community legacy? So that's, and sustainability again, making sure that the infrastructure that's in the investment of infrastructure is focused on offering sustainable benefits to the communities in which it is built, but also how do we make sure that design is as smart as it possibly can be in order to do that. At the centre of the way we are going to work is obviously partnerships. So doing this, we have many partners in the Games at the government level and at the community level, and also industry, business and industry. So that's, I'll leave it there, I think, Toby, given the timeframes, but they're all things that we're currently working on.
Wow, that's really fantastic. Thank you, Marie. And I think, for someone like myself, a sustainability professional, hearing things like renewable energy superpower and climate positive games. That's some really exciting stuff, and we look forward to again digging deeper during the Q&A. But I just before we get into that, just remind everyone on the call that the Q&A function is working down below. So pop your questions in there for the panelists, and we will endeavour to get to them. But I guess for now, if we can get all of our panelists to come back in, join us with their videos, and we will get into this Q&A function. But I guess, Marie, while you're there, I'll ask you a question that was front of mind, which was, really as the first state to formally incorporate sustainability into the business case framework, what was your approach, and what's been the progress to date, and perhaps some of the challenges that you faced?
Hit the wrong button, sorry. Thanks, Toby. Yeah, thanks for the question. We have had a focus on sustainability assessments being built in to all infrastructure projects that are over $100 million. So that's something that we build into our business case development framework, to which all agencies, adhere and they use as a guide as they're developing their business cases. That framework integrates sustainability and resilience considerations from the outset into agencies, our discussions we have with agencies as they are forming ideas about what infrastructure needs they have. And when there's, at that very early stage of developing options. So as they're doing their options development process, our team are working very closely with them and connecting them to our environmental experts across government to try to inform those decisions right at the get-go. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of where we're at with that process. We've also encouraged users to refer to guidance from groups such as this one, around, what are the options, how do they optimize design for circularity, promoting reuse of resources or recycling. So those questions are built into the discussions, the conversations that we have at the beginning. Maximising energy efficiency in the manufacturing and supply process is another focus area we're using, and an aim for 90% of sorry, no, that's a different. I won't worry about getting into that. That might be too hard to explain. But focus on enduring value of those investments through whole of life and a whole of system perspective is all part of the conversation. As part of that, we have about $27 billion worth of capital programs that are currently subject to that sustainability assessment. About 26 billion of that, interestingly, is in roads, is in transport. But we are trying to think about how we're applying those principles into vertical infrastructure as well. And we're looking at the possibility of bringing that level down to 50 million rather than anything over 100, anything over 50 as we move forward. So it's being well received, and I think over the next few years, as the infrastructure is actually on the ground, we'll get a better chance to measure and see how much of an impact we've been able to have.
Fantastic. I might sort of pivot back over to New Zealand, Lalani, and this concept of bringing multiple stakeholders and departments into the decision-making process at this business case phase. I would expect you guys have got a unique take and some learnings from that process in your framework. I wonder if you could just share some of those with us.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's unique per se, because I think all of us as practitioners in the industry have realised that infrastructure is raised by a village. It's not done alone. So, you know, we're appreciative there's many people involved in delivering infrastructure. I think in New Zealand, one of the things that is probably embeds it quite firmly is the treaty principles, and the fact that, you know, there is a real duty on the Crown to respect the obligations under the principles to the Maori peoples, including, you know, their the rights to self-govern and their rights to you know, be involved in decisions involving the land and the environment and things that they value. So, you know, over the years, even though the treaty was signed in what, 1840s or something, it sort of really came to the fore, I think, in the mid-70s, where progressive governments since then have really taken quite seriously their obligations under the treaty. And so you see that quite embedded everywhere. And so I think there's already a natural partnership arrangement embedded in the system here. And also New Zealand's quite devolved in structure compared to maybe the States and Australia, more definitely to the States and Australia. And so, you know, there is a natural culture of doing things together and respecting individuals' roles in the system. So, yeah, I don't know whether we're unique, but certainly there are some structures in place that support working in partnership. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. We have a question from the floor, and I think I'll direct this one at yourself, David, to start with. But the question is, we've heard of wellbeing, how wellbeing is embedded in the New Zealand framework, and how do the Queensland and New Zealand frameworks look at wellbeing in their decisions about future infrastructure? So I'll hand that to yourself, David, and then Marie, you can come back in as well.
Yeah, thanks, Toby, and fascinating conversation before and presentation from Marie. Thank you. Something that I know, because I work a bit with Infrastructure New South Wales. Interestingly, now we're preparing our state infrastructure strategy at the moment and really looking at again how we can embed sustainability. I think getting back to that question, Toby, I think. One of the things that we're certainly focusing on, which gets to some of those case studies that I mentioned before, is really looking at the social sort of aspects, the social impact sort of aspects of the developments, which I think sort of encapsulate some of those well-being sort of aspects as well. So take an example of the base precinct, which I was referring to in my presentation. Interestingly, there, what we're finding is that during COVID, when a lot of people have been working from home, the actual impacts on people have been you know, multiplied, because whilst we've traditionally had this sort of approach of saying that yes, you know, you can do construction at quite significant sort of levels during the day, but just don't do things at night where you might be impacting on people's sleep. That's had different impacts on people, obviously, from working from home in a very dense sort of environment. So it begs some of those questions around how we're sort of managing social impacts and how we're sort of taking those things into account when we're planning our infrastructure. So I think, I mean, I guess the answer to that question really is that certainly at a development assessment level or at a precinct sort of level, those sorts of changes are now being taken into account, and we're demanding, if you like, that wellbeing and social issues are taken into account through those assessments.
And Marie.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. It's a really good question. Thank you. I think, I mean, I think what we've done sort of traditionally is more to sort of separate our social infrastructure planning from our economic infrastructure planning. I think that's been a sort of classic approach that you know, we're still doing you know, to a degree in Queensland, but I think that's where it's the opportunity to take that slightly more holistic view of the planning, and to think about how the social and the economic infrastructure can coalesce and can build off and support each other in a sense. So I think it's still, I would not want to claim that we had it sorted. I think we've got a long way to go. And the New Zealand work that Lalani, that you've been talking about, you know, is a really rich source for us of learnings and ideas and information about how we might go about that. So I think, you know, we're still going. I guess the other thing I would say is that I think it's also about being able to measure it in a meaningful way. And that is certainly exercising our minds as well at the moment. You know, we're looking at how that's being done. We've certainly been looking around the country and looking at the New Zealand model to try to sort of see how might we take a different approach to that, and I guess more kind of citizen-centric in our thinking when it comes to that. You know, we as infrastructure boffins, dare I say, we kind of get a bit obsessed with numbers and Gantt charts and you know, I think it's good to step back and actually think about whether there's a completely different way of seeing this and of thinking about what those benefits actually are and how we measure.
I'm a sustainability boffin and an engineer for my sins back in the day, so I do like a number, but I understand completely the challenge that you're articulating. But I think I take that and segue into a question that's been going through my mind, which is there's a common theme here around resilience and adaptation, and the cost of adaptation is something that has been raised in many different quarters. And I was wondering, in terms of budgeting for that future adaptation cost from a departmental perspective or asset level, I was wondering, you know, what your perspectives are and what some of the current thinking around that. And I guess I'll throw this one, I guess, to Lalani from Treasury, seeing it's a numbers one, and see what the thoughts are from your end.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Yes, I think yes, fair enough, reasonable. You throw it to the Treasury person because it's got to do with money. It's quite interesting. The approach here in New Zealand is the balancing of the fiscal and the well-being. So it's quite a nuanced conversation. And I'm kind of going back to Marie's point. I think infrastructure has evolved in the fact that it focuses on, you know, outcomes for citizens, integration and city planning. So we've kind of evolved from a rural asset base to a sort of a city planning basis, which kind of suggests that whilst maybe more explicit in New Zealand, the difference between social and different capitals and well-being, the well-being thinking is present in the way that, you know, Queensland and New South Wales do things. It's just more explicit in New Zealand. But in terms of, so therefore from a well-being plus outcomes perspective, the money absolutely is important. It's not you know, the bucket is not whatever you call it. It's got a limit. But it's the outcomes that we're looking for in it. So it's the lens in terms of how we think about the outcomes. And like Queensland, you know, New Zealand has its fragilities in terms of scale and frequency of natural events, earthquakes, you know. We're an agriculturally high dependent country, so very susceptible to droughts and floods. And what does that mean in terms of our resilience and the need to plan and adapt for climate change impacts going forward? So I think, you know, we talked about measuring the well-being. So we do measure that, and we have a number of indicators that we collect data on across the system. And so in the context of resilience or sustainability, you know, we collect data on air quality, access to the natural environment, water quality, greenhouse gas emissions, drinking water, biodiversity, waste management, all these different types of sustainable food production, all these different types of indicators, which we would suggest demonstrate or lead to a view about how to measure the well-being benefits and or against the costs of the proposed projects, etc. So it's the balance of the two, and that's why we bring everything together, the traditional tools, as well as how we sort of expand the way we try to measure the benefits. We hope to try to get that balance right in terms of investment versus, outcomes for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And quadruple bottom line is absolutely, well, that's the terminology we use here at the IS Council. But I'm not sure, David or Marie, if you'd like to weigh in on this topic.
I mean, I think, Toby, the only thing that I would add is that, in terms of planning up front for that sort of future adaptation costs, again, it means sort of trying not to design out things. So as much as possible, having some flexibility. I mean, I'll give a quick case study of some work that when I used to work at Transport for New South Wales, about 15 years ago, we developed one of the first sort of sustainability strategies, and we had this huge rollout of commuter car parks that we were doing at the time. Not quite as controversial as some of the federal ones that have been in the media recently. But with that, we were looking at ways that we could try and build sustainability into the car park rollout. And one of the things we talked about was providing circuitry for future electric vehicle charging. And interestingly, at the time, we sort of put forward an ambition to have 5% of the car parks with this ability to have the circuitry in place. And we were told the costs were prohibitive of that. Therefore, we went back to 1%. And it's interesting reflecting back on that, 15 years ago, that's now clearly, why wouldn't you try and do it for 100% of car park spaces, right? So it's trying to make sure that you don't, not that we can all be, we can all have the crystal ball, but we can see those sorts of trends that are happening and those opportunities. So it's really making sure that we keep our eyes open and don't design those things out.
Yep. I think that would, the only thing I would say is just to sort of support what David said about the flexibility, being really critical to be thinking about that. I mean, I think we've all lived through we're living through the COVID-19 sort of impacts, and we would never have foreseen a few years ago some of the changes that we're seeing now, and how do we actually take the good of that and make sure we are factoring that in. I think we've all learned new ways of working and where we work from and how we do it, how we use technology. So I think there's a thousand great ideas and great things that have come from that. But it's having foresight, I think, is a really valuable tool in this process.
I guess on that note, I guess there's a broader sort of forward-looking question to each of the panelists is, from your perspectives, what do you guys think we could do better? What would be the key areas where we think we could or should be focusing to drive positive outcomes, obviously? Anyone wants to?
I can have the first sort of go at this, and then I'm sure everybody else's answers will improve on what I put forward. But look, I think from my point of view, it's really sort of having a bit of a lessons learned culture. So it's interesting that Marie, obviously part of the focus in Queensland at the moment obviously is on the Olympics in 2032, and I'm old enough to remember what we did in Sydney back in 2000, and of course that was billed very much as the Green Games, and there was this huge sort of legacy that we were looking to have. We're still trying to work out the legacy, in all honesty. We're still trying to to maximise, you know, the opportunities that were there 20 odd years ago now. And there was some fabulous sort of innovations that came through that process that I don't feel that we picked up on enough. So it's clearly sort of having the ability to embed that sort of benefits, embed those sort of legacies into our system really early, and make sure that we don't miss those opportunities. So to me, that sort of seems to now, you know, this conversation that we've been having around around well-being and legacy, I think is really important, because it hasn't happened nearly enough in the past.
Lalani or Marie, anyone else?
So I think we touched on a little bit before, but from my perspective, the technology developments and technology, digital disruption, all of that, and just the way that COVID showed us, as Marie said, that there's so many different ways that citizens want to interact with and access services, and can interact and access services, has really kind of probably disrupted the way we think about what are the right solutions for the future. And it's probably how do those thought processes get put into our initial planning, and not get, as David said, sort of optioned out too early. And what does that mean in terms of flexibility? You know, we talk about multi-purposing buildings. You know, vertical infrastructure can be today a hospital, tomorrow a school, and the next day a prison. We talk about corridors, transport corridors, particularly if flying vehicles start to get some traction in the next 50, 60, 100 years. Will they become the corridors of the future, as opposed to road vehicles, etc.? So it's more, it's the futuristic type of thinking, which is quite different to the financial or the engineering or the typical infrastructure way of thinking. And how does that get more embedded up front to support the no regret decisions, I think, in terms of our sector?
Yeah, no, fascinating. Marie, we have just briefly, we're coming to the end.
Oh, look, I would just support what David and Lalani have already said, and I think if there's one thing we probably just need to do better, it's the partnership stuff. It's
Absolutely,
you know, who we work with, how we work with them. You know, procurement is just one example of that, and I think, you know, more collaborative models have to be found in order to get the outcomes that we're all searching for. So I'd say I'd leave it at that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session. I feel like we didn't even scratch the surface of this topic, and we didn't have long enough really at all. But sincerely, just like to thank all our panelists here today, Lalani, David, Marie. Thank you very much for joining us, and for everyone on the line. Thanks for joining us. And we hope that you found this really interesting. If you'd like to get more involved with the IS planning work that I mentioned before, please reach out to myself or Kerry. Our next Future Focus Forum is on infrastructure procurement, which should be very interesting, on the 10th of November. So we very much hope you can join us for that session too. And just as one last bit of admin, if you don't mind, there's a feedback form at the end of this session that'll pop up. So if you'd like to put in other suggestions for topics you'd like to hear about, or a brief survey after this, please fill it in. But thank you again. Thanks to the panelists again, and thanks for everyone who's dialed in.